Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this, the last Bonavero discussion group of this academic year. And we're particularly delighted to welcome today Dr. Agnes Callamard, the new Secretary General of Amnesty International and former UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial, summary, or arbitrary killings. We're also delighted because Dr. Callamard has been a long-time teacher on the summer programs on human rights that are offered by my colleagues, Dr. Nazila Ghanay and Dr. Shreya Atre. And so it's great to have her back in Oxford, even though, of course, given the circumstances, she's not actually here in person. We're also very delighted to be welcoming one of the fellows on the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism Journalist Fellowship Program, Peter Adeyi, who is an investigative reporter, editor, and independent journalist from Hungary, who works at 4.hu. Agnes and Peter are going to be talking about the report that Agnes prepared as in her role as special rapporteur on the extrajudicial killing of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. But before we do that, I'm going to start by asking Agnes for her impressions and her sense of the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead in relation to her new role as Secretary General of Amnesty International. She joins Amnesty International from her former role as a professor at Columbia University, where she ran a Freedom of Expression Institute. Agnes, maybe you might tell us a little bit about, now here you are 2 months into the job, what do you see as both the possibilities and challenges in relation to Amnesty going forward?
Well, thank you very much, Kate. Thank you to the Bonavero Institute for inviting me. It's good to be back. I've been there physically during when I was teaching at the summer human rights program, and by agreeing to become Secretary General of Amnesty International, there were many fantastic dimension to that position, but the one that is not so lovely is that I could not pursue my yearly involvement at Oxford, which I just loved. Anyway, now I'm at Amnesty. I've been there for 2 months. It is an honor. It is a pleasure. It's daunting. It's a big organization. We just celebrated the 60th anniversary of Amnesty. Therefore, it has an old history, and sometimes that can be a bit heavy to carry moving forward, particularly in a fast-changing world like the one we are confronting. Sorry. So, the challenges that I am facing as the Secretary General and the entire organization, in fact, are first of all very similar to the one that the human rights community is confronting, which is an interplay of challenges which are in many ways, in my view, unprecedented, both on their own and together. We are looking at historical dynamics and pressure, which started before this historical period and will go long after, after we are possibly dead. Here I'm talking, for instance, about climate change. I'm talking about inequality between and within state. I'm talking about the demographic divide. They are not all threats to human rights, but they are certainly challenges to human rights. I'm also talking about the new industrial revolution, and I'm sure Peter and I will talk about it, which has huge implications for our societies, for what it means to be human, to robotic in particular, to anything related to biology, and it has, of course, implications for human rights. So those are the historical trends, and how they impact on human rights is largely a factor of how we're going to interact with them. And of course, there may be systemic aspects that we may not be able to control or prevent. But this is a big, this is a background, but it's a background that is present. And then we have the current, the more historically specific challenge, which is a reconstruction of the international system, the conflict between two superpowers, the US and China, Russia playing a disrupting role. And as we have experienced during the Cold War, this kind of binary conflict for hegemonic purposes have, defined in many ways the human rights challenges. They are characterized by the armament race. They are characterized by a multiplication of hotspots. They are characterized by proxy conflict, colonization in some way or another. I mean, they don't call it that way, but what we do in the space right now on those planets is what we used to do, a century ago. It's the same dynamic of territorial control and influence. That has direct and very present implications for us as a human rights community. We're confronting right now our failure in tackling much older challenges such as racism, which is very currently a huge challenge for us as a human rights community, because if we don't respond effectively to it, internally and externally, our capacity to speak with authority will be gone. So our inclination, commitment, and strength in tackling racism, and I mean internally and externally, is extremely important for the human rights community. So these are some of the current context, and wrapping it all, as if it was not enough, is the ideological battle. So all of those long-term and current conflicts are also played out at the normative level. So it's not just that we are confronting human rights violations, that we've always done, but we are confronting an attack on the ideal of human rights. So we are confronting very well-organized campaign, very well-organized state that are saying, well, after all, UN Charter or not, Universal Declaration or not, we don't believe that human rights is the glue that binds us together. We want to put some alternative, some normative alternative based on, in fact, a rejection of human rights, racial supremacy, rejection of the other, national protection, national boundaries, construction of walls, to protect against migrants, to protect against those that are not vaccinated, to protect against anyone that we don't like, basically. So that has practical implications, but at the heart of it is a normative battle for the soul of our international society. So you're asking me the challenges, that's what they are, really. And for me, they are unprecedented. I mean, I have a short history period. I'm looking at, what happened from 1940 to now, basically. The Holocaust and World War II was an incredible challenge. There were genocide over the last 70 years. Colonization and the decolonization was very bloody. And so on. But right now, I think what is really standing out for me is the fact that everything is happening at once, that we have those forces and pressure that are coming together in a so-called perfect storm. And that's why we have to be strong. That's why we have to be bold. The challenges for Amnesty International, and probably for others, but particularly for Amnesty, because it's an old organization and it's heavy and it's large, is to be agile enough to respond quickly to those challenges. The challenge for us is to be bold enough and not to fall back on what we've done for the last 60 years, but to be prepared to be ambitious, to be prepared to go on the offensive. and not just to be resisting the change. You know, many people over the last few years have said, oh, now is not the right time to push for that because of Russia, because of China, and so on. And my response has been, you know, if we are taking that position, there will never be a good time for the next 50 years. So we can be tactical as a community, and we know how to be tactical, but we need to keep going on the offensive in the same way that we established, Amnesty and others, the High Commissioner position, many Special Rapporteur position, that we were instrumental for some of the conventions over the last 30 years, human rights defenders, torture, and so on, against racial discrimination. In the same way, we created the system for the international community. We need now to be prepared to say, okay, it has worked, more or less. It's now time to rethink it. And we need to be prepared to confront the fact that those institutions are no longer fit for purpose. And even though we created them or we helped create them, we need to have the intellectual and political acuity and courage to say now it's time to think about something else. So these are what I see as our challenges as a human rights community, finding partnership beyond, you know, across boundaries, across rights, beyond, you know, history and so on. Partnership is going to be key for all of us moving forward, because they are very organized now in front of us, and there are many of them. So we can't afford to be lonely. We can't afford to go on the battle alone. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Agnes. That's a very, I find, very cogent and compelling account of our current challenges and the fact that we need to go forward energetically and rather than defensively. So one of the things you mentioned, and it begins to lead us towards the report that you did in relation to the Khashoggi affair, is your suggestion that the existing international human rights mechanisms may need some rethinking. And that does lead me to your role as UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial killings, and what you think the particular challenges are facing special rapporteurs, and perhaps also what you think may be the institutional changes. And obviously these have been under review in the UN system now over the last few years, but what do you think the changes are that you would like to see here to improve or empower these institutions to be able to promote and fulfill human rights more effectively?
Well, you know, I think special rapporteurs are a wonderful invention, and they still play an important role, and we see that on a regular basis. We've seen it over the last few months over Israel-Palestine, over Ukraine, not Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. You know, I mean, I'm not going to say anything very inventive here. One of the issues with a special rapporteur, several of the issues are resources. So there is insufficient resources in general. The fact that as an independent body, we're still very dependent on the OHCHR, which has its strengths and weaknesses. I will say quite a few weaknesses that we should be fully aware about, the fact that it can be heavy to move as a special rapporteur when you have an institution such as the OHCHR, which is not always acting as independently as it could. We are dependent on our resources from the OHCHR, and that means, you know, that there is a certain degree of compromise and qui pro quo around that relationship. Our capacity to act is actually quite large, whether or not we are always able to seize on the opportunity or to have the support needed so that we can be proactive, adventurous, and courageous, that's a different matter. When I undertook my investigation into Jamal Khashoggi's killing, I met a lot of resistance. I will not say that I met full front opposition, because it was very clear to everyone within the system that I was working from within my mandate. So I was not at all going outside the mandate. What I was doing is taking the mandate and saying, that's how I'm going to use the mandate, because that's what the mandate allows me to do. And even though it has not been done, it doesn't mean I cannot do it. But I met resistance, you know, I will say almost at all level and at all, you know, in many dimensions. It can be not being given the financial resources I was entitled to, not being given the staff I asked for to assist me, not, you know, being little remarks. Are you sure it's the right thing? You're going to be, you know, why him? Why not someone? You know, I mean, so the whole environment was not conducive at all. It's only after I started in January, I'd say it's only maybe by September that people could start seeing what the methodology I had adopted and the overall approach I had adopted, what it could do for human rights generally, not, I mean, for Jamal as well, but more, you know, beyond Jamal, how to work on the basis of the case study, to work in a more, to begin with the case and to move into the more generic, which is basically the opposite of what we tend to do as special rapporteur, how that could open up possibilities, how by working really in depth in one case, you can see as if you were using, I don't know, you call them those lenses that, you know, like a microscope. By doing an in-depth case, it's like putting a microscope on the system and you can see, bang, everything that doesn't work, everything that is missing, all the gaps that you will not necessarily see if you always work at that level, if you always begin with the principle and stick to engaging with the principles. So the methodology really, I think, became clear to a larger number of people, and they could see how much it could unveil and what an empowering thing it was to do. So, you know, special rapporteurs have huge opportunities. They can do so much. We just need, beyond resources, I think if we give them the key message, be courageous, be brave, you know, explore, be an adventurer, really. Don't feel compelled to repeat doing what has been done for the last 40 years. And in fact, they don't. But, you know, it's just about creating that environment where we feel empowered to move forward, to explore, to push, you know, to resist the naysay, no, you can't do that. You know, that's, I think, will make us, well, I'm no longer there, but special procedures such a powerful tool. Treaty bodies are a different beast, and I don't know them. I've worked with them. I'm very impressed with them, but it's, you know, it's a much more institutionalized and collective way of, and therefore it has a certain legitimacy that, and a normative legitimacy that, you know, we may not have as individuals. But the special rapporteurs can, you know, they can be the adventurers of the human rights world if they want to. And many are, you know, we talk about my work. Niels Melzer has done a lot. David Kay has done quite a lot around you know, the non-state actors. My dear predecessor Christophe, on a normative level, was really, I mean, he did not adopt at all the same methodology as me of the case study, you know, but he was such a brilliant normative and legal mind, and he pushed You know, I mean, I've relied for 5 years, I've relied on everything he had done normatively. So, you know, it's just a wonderful invention. We just need to protect it against Russia and others that want to clip our wings and incentivize all of them to push.
Well, thank you, Agnes, and thank you also for mentioning Christoph, because, you know, his tragic death just a couple of months ago, he was one of the members of the advisory council of the Bonavera Institute and a great supporter of the Bonavera Institute in his early years. And as you say, a wonderful international lawyer who's made a huge contribution to in a range of ways to international human rights law procedures and mechanisms. But turning then to the actual events around the Jamal Khashoggi affair, I mean, maybe you could just give our listeners who perhaps haven't read the report, the key findings in the report as to what actually happened that you discovered as a result of your investigation.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. So I don't have to rehearse the fact. I think people may know them. What I did and what I uncovered, I followed a human rights methodology. So I really focused on the state and on the role of the state, which I think is an important and crucial dimension of what we can bring to international law. That said, in the context of my investigation, I erred a bit in international criminal law, or not international necessarily, but I also considered individuals' responsibilities. But the key driver was, what did the state do or did not do? Okay, and in particular, what did the state of Saudi Arabia do? I also looked at the US and Turkey for different reasons. So what I found is that the state of Saudi Arabia had planned, had organized, had premeditated the execution of Jamal Khashoggi. I insist on the premeditation aspect of it. I did not suggest that this was premeditated for months. I even suggested it may just have been premeditated over 48 hours. But it was premeditated, it was planned, it was resourced by the state, and that can be shown and evidenced in many ways, including through where the murder took place, the identity of the 15 perpetrators that were all state officials and 14 of them security officials. They traveled on some of them on diplomatic passport. They used a plane that had diplomatic clearance. Their hotel and so on was covered by state resources. I discovered much later, after I finished my investigation, that in fact the private plane they traveled on, which had the diplomatic clearance, is owned by a trust which is owned by the Crown Prince. So, you know, the linkages between the crime, I mean, the crime took place in a consulate and there is not too many more state-like institutions. The consul himself was involved, and so on and so forth. So independently of the weight of the recording of the killing, which, you know, people put a lot of focus on and which I fully understand, there are a lot of other evidence which points directly to the responsibility of the state of Saudi Arabia for the killing. So it's an extrajudicial execution. In addition to that, a number of other violations took place. It was an enforced disappearance, and in my view continues to be one, because the body has never been found and because the explanation given by Saudi Arabia are way insufficient to alleviate or to suggest that we no longer have an enforced disappearance. The explanation is absolutely not credible. Therefore, under international law, it's still an enforced disappearance. According to the Committee Against Torture, what happened to him was also a form of torture, what happened to Jamal. So here we have a violation of the Convention Against Torture. We also have violations of international law, violations of the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations, violation of the UN Charter that prohibits the use of force in times of peace. And what the action consisted of is really an extraterritorial, extrajudicial use of force against an individual. So that's too is a violation of the UN Charter. It was a violation of the principle and freedom of expression, because it's a journalist who was targeted, and he was targeted because of his work, because of who he was as a journalist. There is absolutely no doubt about the fact, about the motivations behind the targeting. Because he was a US resident, maybe not in terms of having a green card, but in terms of his other legal status, I have argued that it was also an attack against the United States, because they targeted one of his residents who was working for the Washington Post, and a symbol in the United States in many ways. It was also, of course, an attack, violations of Turkey's territorial integrity. So the violations committed by the state of, and I'm not talking about what happened after the crime, meaning the crime continued, when they pretended to go and investigate, when in fact they sent a team of 17 that time, 17 individuals, all representative of the state, and that they used the 2 weeks they controlled the crime scene to clean it up. That too is a violation. And then what happened during the trial? Anyway, the violations committed by the state of Saudi Arabia are multiple, many of them in human rights law term, and a few of them in international law more generally, not related to human rights law. So having established that responsibility, I was then interested to think, what do I mean by the state? And of course, it was Saudi Arabia. So it would have been difficult not to ask that question, because we are dealing with a regime that is dominated by 1 or 2 individuals. So when you talk of the state, it's a logical question to say, if the state is responsible, does that mean that the king is responsible, or indeed the crown prince? So that pushed me to unpack a little bit what I meant by the state in that context, and relying a bit on the work done by Commission of Inquiries before me, in particular the Commission of Inquiry on Sri Lanka. I used that, the fact that they had already done a bit of thinking around that to think and to propose the evidence I had collected, which could show that Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, was responsible individually, criminally, for what had happened. I was very careful in the way I put that in that report. I said there is credible evidence demanding additional investigation into his personal responsibility. So I did not claim I had it all. I just said, look, this is what I collected, and what I collected clearly shows that there are a lot of questions to be asked with regard to his responsibility. And to do so, I relied a lot on the law of criminal responsibilities, whether under international law or in most domestic jurisdictions. I pointed to the fact that there is a spectrum that could be applied to Mohammed bin Salman, from having ordered the crime to having turned a blind eye, or having failed in his due diligence function, because most of those people reported to him, by the way, or were very close to him. The distance between him and the perpetrators in terms of active perpetrators is not as big as he pretended it to be. They were really in his inner circle. So, that's what I showed. I showed that there is absolutely no doubt that his responsibility is engaged. And on a range of probability, there is very strong probability he is directly responsible for ordering or inciting the killing. But I was careful in the way I did it at the time. Now I'm less careful, but in terms of the report, I took certain precautions. I'm not sure I've responded to your questions, but here we go. You're muted, Kate, you're muted.
Thank you. So that's very clear. Thank you very much. I mean, in some ways, we've seen an event in the last couple of weeks, which is in some ways a similarly shocking act by a state in relation to freedom of speech and international law, and that is the incident in Belarus. And I just wondered whether you think that our existing systems of international human rights law are really able to deal with these extraordinarily egregious breaches of principle. Whether there's anything we can do in the light of the, as you outlined at the beginning, the relatively perilous circumstances we are in as a matter of geopolitics, whether there's anything we could do further about that.
Thank you, Kate. If anyone is interested in checking my report, I have a big chapter on exactly that topic, because the case study on Jamal allowed me to, I thought, okay, that's extraterritorial. That's really brazen, no? Is it happening often? Then I realized, doing a bit more research, that actually there were quite a lot of dissidents targeted extraterritorially, and my guts told me at the time it's on the increase. So I did a bit more research on that, and indeed, just through anecdotal research, really anecdotal at the time, I said, okay, we are confronting a real problem here, given the context, given the intolerance that is part of the way governments are running at the moment, and in particular the control on information, the control on reputation, and so on. Those dissidents are no longer safe even when they go outside. That was very clear to me through Jamal. So I have basically one chapter, I think it's chapter 4 or 5, that looks at this. I looked at the responsibilities of governments under whose safety dissidents are currently located. So do they have special responsibility vis-a-vis those individuals? That's the question I asked. I used Jamal, and then I went beyond Jamal. I looked for Jamal as to whether the US or Turkey had failed in their responsibility to protect Jamal under international law. That allowed me to unpack what due diligence on the part of those governments mean vis-a-vis a non-national. And it allowed me to deal with a concept that actually was very much discussed in the US, but not so much internationally, the duty to warn. Did the US and Turkey not only, failed in their responsibility to protect and prevent, but in that context, should they have warned Jamal Khashoggi that his life was at stake? If they knew, and what do we mean by if they knew that something was wrong, So that chapter is really trying to unpack knew or should have known in the context of dissident, and how do you implement a duty to warn extraterritorially, which is another pretty radical idea, not mine. In fact, believe it or not, it's coming from the CIA. So I thought, wow, if the CIA is prepared to do that, surely the rest of the world could. The CIA, I think in about a decade ago, or I could not remember that, check the date, the CIA came up with, I think it's called a directive, I don't know, where it unpacked the duty to warn, the CIA duty to warn. Okay, duty to warn citizens and non-citizens, and how does it apply it? And in it, directive, it clearly states that it could warn citizen and non-citizen alike outside the United States if it had, the means and the knowledge or something of that nature. So of course we need to be careful because it's, it's extraterritorial. So in the chapter, I tried to unpack what this duty to warn extraterritorially or indeed domestically applied to non-citizens would look like. And I ended up by saying to all governments, please, first of all, protect people who seek asylum, because we are witnessing a multiplication, more like a Cold War era. So they are coming out and we need to offer asylum, but once we have offered asylum, we need to be prepared to go the extra mileage, i.e. to know that it's not because they are on our territory that those people are protected. They are not. Their governments may still go after them. Members of their own communities may still go after them. We need to protect them. We need to heighten our understanding of the environment so that we have better instruments. So I called on all governments where they are offering safety to dissidents to really review how they protect, how they assess the risk, and how they warn those individuals. We need to have better policing and intelligence instruments to protect, and we need to be also prepared to send very strong message to governments when those dare use force extraterritorially, or indeed surveillance, by the way, because this is the other dimension, and maybe Peter is going to talk about it too. At the moment, many governments have the power to survey their dissident abroad through electronic surveillance. I mean, Amnesty International has done a lot of work on that. Amnesty was, in fact, on the receiving ends of it, but so was Jamal Khashoggi and many other dissidents around him. They were under surveillance by the state of Saudi Arabia using, in most probability, an NSO technology. So all of that is part of the environment. This is why governments, wherever there are dissidents, they really need to take care of them. And it should not act as a deterrent against giving them asylum. It should just heighten their commitment to have the most effective tools to protect those individuals. And internationally, what I've said is that there we have nothing. The international community may be able to tackle crimes against humanity and genocide through commission of inquiries looking at massive human rights violations. But for one single violation, there was one or two exceptions in the 70 years history. We do not have international instrument responding to a single violation, such as the killing of Jamal, and which is why I proposed at least the creation of an international independent investigatory mechanism that will focus on human rights defenders and journalists, because tackling one single incident can actually act as a preventive measures for far worse to come along the way.
Well, thank you. And I think it's a great way to turn now to Peter to look at the other challenges that journalists and the media are facing in many societies As I mentioned at the outset, Peter is an independent journalist in Hungary. And Peter, maybe you might reflect for a minute on your reading of Agnes's report on Jamal Khashoggi, and then talk a little bit about the ways in which repressive and authoritarian governments are limiting and impacting on freedom of media.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Calamard, for your talk and your work on this thorough and profoundly unsettling report. The brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi and violent attacks on journalists elsewhere in the world have a detrimental impact on global press freedom. These vicious acts have a substantial chilling effect. Reporters covering abuses of power, editors criticizing autocrats can clearly see how certain regimes will stop at nothing to silence them. The murders of Jamal Khashoggi in Turkey, Jan Kuciak in Slovakia, or Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta not only silenced their voices, but probably dissuaded many others from speaking up. These attacks not only target individuals, but also affect all journalists navigating authoritarian environments. Especially when these offenses are committed with impunity, like in the case of Mr. Khashoggi. This emboldens violent actors to interfere with free press and weaponize spaces previously thought to have been safe. No one imagined walking into a consulate could cost a journalist his life, just as no one thought getting on a budget airline traveling between two EU capitals could cost a journalist his freedom, like in the case of Roman Protasevich. His flight was hijacked and forced to land in Minsk, where he was swiftly detained. The increasing frequency of such attacks is horrifying, but the killing or kidnapping of journalists is still considered extreme in the luckier countries of the world. But you can most certainly kill journalism without killing any journalist. It's much more common, even mundane. Yes, it's mostly bloodless, but it's ruthlessly efficient. So, as I said, I work in Hungary at 444.hu, one of the last independent newsrooms in the country. Well, over the past decade, the Hungarian government drastically reshaped our media environment without drawing one drop of blood. They used state and EU subsidies to create vast business empires, and then had the friendly oligarchs at the top of these empires reinvest their profits in the media. One by one, these oligarchs acquired key Hungarian media outlets, closing some altogether, installing new editors and journalists in others. Their new job is to push the government's carefully crafted political messages. After years of acquisitions and mergers, government-aligned actors created KESMA, the Central European Media and Publishing Foundation, which now controls over 450 outlets in Hungary. The state also weaponizes advertising spending. According to the Hungarian Advertising Association, the state is the single largest advertiser in the country. It's not the automakers, not the banks, not the telecom companies. It's the government with their campaigns about, the evils of George Soros and immigration and so forth. Over the past few years, they spent hundreds of millions of euros on advertising, and they almost exclusively advertise with pro-government outlets. Privately owned companies, especially those operating in heavily regulated sectors like banking or telecommunication, are also very cautious about where they advertise, not wanting to upset the government. This is how the state systematically starves independent media. There is no physical violence. Hungarian journalists do not have to fear for their safety. These things mostly happen in broad daylight and appear to be legal, maybe even compatible with the rules of the European Union. Yet they lead to the creation of a media environment in which critical voices are silenced or drowned out by the loudspeakers of government propaganda. I'm currently on a fellowship at the Reuters Institute here in Oxford, surrounded by an exceptional group of journalists and editors from around the world. Most of the stories they share about state and political interference are not about physical violence either. Like when Jakub Krupa, our fellow from Poland, told us how powerful actors in his country use an endless stream of lawsuits to intimidate and distract outlets. slaps, strategic lawsuits against public participation launched against independent outlets and journalists are depressingly effective in the hands of the powerful. Adiel Santelli, an environmental journalist from Brazil and also a fellow here in Oxford, told us about hate mail she started getting over her coverage of deforestation in the Amazon region. The threats started arriving after her country's controversial president, Jair Bolsonaro, made his views, often clashing with the scientific consensus, clear on the issue among his supporters. Even in India, where physical violence against journalists does occur, it's still not the most prominent form of interference, as our fellow from Delhi, Ipshita Chakravarti, told us. There are mundane forms of harassment by authorities, intimidating visits by security services, and increasingly, imprisonment of journalists. The state often uses legislation around national security to silence and sometimes imprison critics. There are no dramatic hijacking of an airliner with fighter jets, just the state's legal apparatus put to work to stymie public discourse. Like in India and national security legislation, states often cite crisis to restrict free expression. Sometimes this creates a complicated landscape for reporters to navigate. Bermet Talant, also a fellow at the Reuters Institute, a Kyrgyz reporter working for years in Ukraine, told us about the challenges independent journalists and media outlets face working in a country that is at war with a much larger occupying force. When a country is under physical attack by an invading army, how do you get both sides of the story? And what if a government cites some other emergency to increase its control over the public discourse? My home country, Hungary, is among others where the state amended free speech legislation around the coronavirus pandemic. As of last March, you can be sent to jail for up to 5 years if you are found guilty of scaremongering, spreading false information which may hamper the state's defensive efforts against the virus. Now, no reporters have been prosecuted under these laws, but there are several cases in which police detained regular Hungarians for sharing criticism of the government's pandemic response on Facebook. Most of these cases were eventually dropped by the public prosecutor's office, but highly publicized dawn raids by the police on the homes of ordinary citizens and their temporary detention are more than enough to stop people from speaking up. In Hungary and elsewhere too, the state further centralized the flow of information, creating a near complete blackout, barring medical professionals from speaking to reporters from entering hospitals, and refusing to share some of the most basic numbers around the pandemic. The right to free speech or access to public information is no abstraction here. People should be able to rely on media to give them accurate information so they can make the right decisions about their lives, health, and security. When a few months ago we couldn't report enough on hospitals being overwhelmed, it may have given some people a false sense of security. In a low-choice environment where most outlets just echo the state's victory propaganda, this may have exacerbated the crisis. What happened with Jamal Khashoggi was so brutal, so extreme, it inevitably captured the attention of the whole world, as it should. But we may need to pay more attention to all these other, more mundane forms of interference, from economic pressure to frivolous lawsuits, from restrictions on public information to state-orchestrated smear campaigns against journalists. These transgressions, big or small, dramatic or subtle, must not be ignored. Should the regime get away with them today, it may become more audacious tomorrow. And through incremental steps of repression, some autocrats will end up convincing themselves that it's okay to use violence against the very people who are trying to hold them to account. And on the last note, reflecting on surveillance, a few months after I arrived here in Oxford, I got a very strange email from Google telling me that a state actor tried to get into my email account, and now I'm eligible for whatever the highest level protection program. So yeah, that's also happening a lot, and it's I think it's one of those things where for state, this is a very low effort thing. They can do it with impunity. There's no downside to it. And, you know, it's potentially putting journalists and their sources at risk. So thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for that you know, very clear account and looking at the current techniques for suppressing journalism, as you say, without necessarily spilling a drop of blood. And yes, before we turn to Q&A, would you like to respond to that? And could I also just say to people who are here, this is your chance to put your questions in the Q&A button. I see we already have one, but please go ahead and do that. In the meantime, I'm just going to give Agnes an opportunity to respond to Peter's comments. Being herself an expert in freedom of expression, it'll be very interesting to hear what she has to say.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you very much, Peter. You know, I mean, I completely agree with Peter's comment. Of course, at the moment, I think for a decade now, we have been witnessing a shrinking of press freedom, which did not necessarily involve the use of force. I think, in fact, the use of force is, you know, has been more of, you know, it is kind of, according to the data collected by CPJ, RSF, and others, you know, the use of force is a pretty constant. In fact, it went down in, if I'm not mistaken, in 2019 and 2020. But otherwise, it's a pretty constant. So the shrinking of independent journalism takes place through threat, harassment, legal harassment, use of violence, targeted violence, without mentioning killings. But the greatest threat is the legal, you know, the legal starvation, really, starvation through legal means of independent media, and that we see that almost everywhere, and that indeed is the greatest threat against freedom of the press. In my experience, it's often those legal means are often precede or are part of a low-level harassment, physical harassment, low-level threat. You know, it may not be direct targeted violence, but I think it is also a dimension of the environment that many journalists confront, whether it's online or offline. You know, a fairly high level of vulnerability to you know, to people's act of violence or threats. But no, I mean, I completely agree with Peter's conclusion of, you know, key finding. Working on the act against individual journalists should be an entry point into denouncing a bigger environment, which is targeting independence of the press. I mean, in the case of Turkey and in the case of Saudi Arabia, it is pretty clear that Jamal was not targeted by Saudi out of the blues. You know, there was a pattern of targeting of independent media, independent voice that had gone worse under the new leadership of the Crown Prince. In the case of Turkey, the case of Jamal allowed me to show, or at least, you know, I had to say that while Turkey on the case of Jamal had been okay, actually, clearly this was not the case for Turkish journalists, because there, the space of action of independent journalism in Turkey has almost disappeared over the last 5 years. So we always need to contextualize an act of violence, and the legal attacks, the policy attacks, the political attacks against press freedom are, you know, are very crucial to understanding why those particular individuals may be specifically targeted.
Thank you, Anke. And perhaps I might just start off with a question for Peter, which really relates to the pressure created for the media by the changing business model and the emergence, as it were, of the digital media, which has created a real challenge for established mainstream media, but has also created some opportunities, such as I imagine 444 has undertaken, and you're seeing that in all sorts of countries around the world where there's an emergence of a sort of young, independent, almost entirely online digital news, although accompanied, I think, by precarious terms for journalists in terms of employment. Very often it's on kind of contract bases and so on. And I wondered if you just wanted to reflect on that kind of new model of journalism, which I think is where 444 fits, and its sustainability going forward, both as a question, as it were, of its business model, but perhaps also in more precarious and hostile environments.
Yes, absolutely. So we started in 2013, and I think the initial vision was very naive, if I look back now, is that we are going to grow big and we are going to have advertising revenue and everything is going to be peachy. Now, two things happened which made this dream completely impossible. The first thing was the advent of the big platform companies like Google and Facebook, which just disrupted the digital advertising market completely and scooped up, most of the money there. This is a global phenomenon that affects all media outlets who are doing online advertising everywhere. Now, on top of that, we had the government of Hungary and their pressure on the advertising market, which I described previously. And this sort of made us realize by sort of 2016 that this model that we had in mind, a media outlet supported by advertising, it's just not going to be sustainable. We're not going to survive. So in early 2017, we've turned to our readers and we said, please support our journalism. This was initially a purely sort of a program of micro donations. I think the first months we just put up our bank account number and said, if you can, support us. And that brought in money, and it was good money, it was meaningful money, but it was very little compared to what we needed and what was advertising meant to be. And we tried to balance things out for the longest time. And then the pandemic hit. Now, in early 2020, we were still reliant on digital advertising largely, but because of the effect of the pandemic, that business completely collapsed overnight. Like last March, we lost 70% of our revenue, basically overnight. And we had to sit around the table and make calculations. How many more months do we have money for? And if we fired, one person or two, or if we take progressive pay cuts, how much more time is that going to bring? So then we again sort of stepped up our effort and asked our readers and told them pretty clearly where we are at. We didn't fire anyone. Everyone took progressive pay cuts. So the more you earn, the larger percentage you lost. And then we pleaded with our readers, and it worked. It worked for two reasons. I think one of the sort of most theoretical is a lot of talk about trust in news. It's declining. Audience trust in news is declining. How do we navigate around that? How do we rebuild the trust? But I think there's something to be said for outlets needing to trust their audiences, that they can in fact rely on them, that some people understand the value of independent journalism and will be willing to support it financially. Now, there was another element to this dynamic in Hungary. So as I said, the government kept acquiring outlets over the past decade, but the pace of new acquisitions slowed by 2019, and the Prime Minister went on record and said, oh, now he feels the sort of proportions are largely 50-50, which we took it as a signal as, okay, now there's like things in balance. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to support this kind of thinking, but this was, I think, the message from the top. But I think the pandemic created an opportunity for the government to push more in this realm. This was multiple reasons. First of all, in a crisis like this, press freedom is not on the forefront of people's minds. It's just not. When it's life and death, you think about other things. The other factor was the first wave spared Hungary, and the government enjoyed a boost in popularity. So they felt this is an opportunity, they can move, and they took over the largest independent digital outlet, Index. It was the very same method as all the other time. It was a new owner swooping in, firing, 3 weeks later, the editor-in-chief over something, and then most of the staff resigned in process. But I think this was a cataclysmic event in Hungary, which made audiences realize that if they are not going to pay for independent media, there's not going to be independent media. And I think for us, this really turned things around, and really a lot of people who previously supported us with little money decided to support us regularly with more money, and people who never supported us wrote emails and said, listen, I'm willing to put my money here now. And that meant that by the end of the autumn, we could give back the pay cuts we took, and we could hire more people. We hired some of the people who lost their jobs when the government took over Index, and we have experienced our best. And I know how this sounds, but like a very good year, both financially in terms of volume of content. We grew, we have more reporters, we publish more, and we are on a more sort of sustainable setting. So yes, it's very difficult. And what I'm doing here in Oxford is look at audience revenue models in sort of problematic political environments, because to be perfectly honest, I'm a little bit worried that the government is going to catch up, and the pressure now is on digital advertising. But, what is stopping them for saying, okay, so yeah.
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, encouraging to hear that you've had a good year in this very difficult time, and also encouraging to see how agile you can be in. Turn to the Q&A, and we've got some really interesting questions. I'm going to put them all to you both, and we'll start with Agnes to respond to them. So the first one is, what avenues you see, Agnes, at the international level, or perhaps at the national level in terms of universal jurisdiction, for bringing Saudi Arabian and perhaps we've been talking about Belarusian governments and or government officials to account for the egregious violations of human rights that they've committed. So the possible avenues at either the international or the domestic level through universal jurisdiction for bringing governments and or officials to account. And then the next one is from my colleague Shreya Atre, to thank you both for an excellent seminar, and to say, Agnes, that you'll be missed at the summer residential in Oxford this year. But to ask whether you think your report on Jamal Khashoggi marked a new trend, not only for the extrajudicial killings mandate, but also for other special rapporteurs and their mandates in taking particular cases, as you've argued in your presentation, that this micro-level focus and detail may enable one to draw more general patterns and conclusions of bigger systemic concerns, and whether you see this as a methodological trend that may have been established, and whether this might clash with more adjudicative work of individual communications procedures, tribunals, or courts. So that's Shreya's question. And then the last question is whether you think that the change in leadership in the United States from former President Trump to President Biden might somehow allow a fairer investigation and perhaps a fuller investigation into the extrajudicial killing of Jamal Khashoggi, and might result in sanctions against Saudi Arabia or against the Crown Prince.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the questions and the engagement. I think two of them are really around accountability. for the killing of Jamal Khashoggi and whether our system of justice, national or international, is fit for purpose. What I have argued from the beginning, I think, or certainly what I have thought from the beginning and what I have argued fairly quickly on, is that we need to understand accountability outside a formal judicial process in cases like Jamal Khashoggi, because to suggest that the only way we can imagine justice is for MBS to be behind the dock in fact, it's almost a declaration of powerlessness from the beginning. You know, it is very unlikely, unless there is a major regime change in Saudi Arabia, or unless there is, you know, a coup within the court, that this would happen. But does that mean that justice will not be delivered through other ways? And that's what I have asked myself, and that's what I've kept asking people who were concerned about the absence of formal accountability. In my view, MBS has already paid a price for what he did. I think his capacity to travel abroad is very limited at the moment. There are 3 lawsuits against him that name him in the United States. There is at least 1 in Europe at the moment, in Germany, and I have no doubt that there will be more coming up under the principle of universal jurisdiction in Europe. In the US, it's under civil or criminal domestic law. Of course, he could still travel because he could benefit from the immunity of the of the prince. But I'm not sure governments are going to be, you know, falling over themselves to invite him and to confront an outcry domestically. So I think the fact that right now MBS cannot do anything, cannot open his mouth, cannot travel without the name of Jamal Khashoggi or indeed Loujain al-Assoui or any other people currently detained, I think that's already a victory. The fact that right now very few people dare suggest that he is a modernizing prince, that too is a victory. We've completely addressed the king. You know, he's naked. There is nothing he can pretend anymore. He's completely naked. And that's a product of our work, of our advocacy, of our investigation, you know, journalists, my own civil society. So to me, it's a form of justice, and it is something we need to hold on to, and it is something we need to use for other leaders, would-be leaders, because they don't like to have their reputation tarnished in that fashion. You know, they really, I don't think they do. So that, of course, it's not like putting him behind the dock, but it is something, and we need to be prepared to look for alternative in context where we think that particular form of justice is going to be very difficult to get. Doesn't mean we stop looking for it. Of course, we keep asking for it, but we also look for other things we can do so that his life as a leader is actually pretty difficult right now. Universal jurisdiction is something I've argued in my report as well, because for the reasons I've just said, I could not see a very good outcome of coming out of the Saudi judicial system. So I suggested that the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, because of the forms he took, and because of the many other violations, including a violation of 2 conventions, disappearance and torture, because there is nothing preventing us really to argue that a single act can fall within the universal jurisdiction. Yes, it's supposed to be serious and grave, but why can't we suggest that a single act reach to the level of seriousness and gravity that is required under universal jurisdiction. In my report, I've invited lawyers, I've invited civil society to push and to think beyond what we've done for the last 30, 40 years, because we need to give ourselves more tools. And I'm glad to see that Reporters Without Borders has actually done so and has filed a complaint for crimes against humanity against MBS in a German court, not just looking at Jamal, but all of the targeting of journalists and press freedom in Saudi Arabia. So yes, we need to be prepared, and the best legal mind must be prepared to, to see what they can do with our existing system and to stretch it where it's needed so that it is made fit for purpose. Whether or not this would apply to Belarus is a different question. Here, there are sanctions against Belarus. There are some sanctions against Saudi Arabian individuals. I support individual sanctions myself. I think they are a way of avoiding the impact of state sanctions, which can be pretty awful for the people of those countries. So, targeted sanctions against the individuals that have perpetrated the crime, I think is a form of punishment, which is great. But if we don't go to the top, then I'm not sure we're being very effective. If we don't go after those individuals at the highest level, then we're not being effective. And that's where I think Joe Biden, notwithstanding some of the steps he took, such as revealing in a very high-level way the findings of the Director of National Intelligence regarding the prince's responsibility for the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, they did not move from putting out their conclusion that the prince was responsible for ordering the crime to let's sanction him now. They just stopped at being transparent and then said, well, there is nothing we can do and it's not appropriate, blah, blah, blah. So that was extraordinarily disappointing. And in my view, a failure on the part of the Biden administration to take full stock of the instrument they have with individualized sanction. So they are meaningful if they hit high. In the case of Belarus, we need to hit the president. Do they work targeting an airline? Maybe, but then again, you're punishing a lot of people who are completely unrelated to the attack. Any Belarusian who wants to get out right now is facing quite a lot of difficulties. Case study versus adjudication. Very good questions. I stayed clear of making myself, as I said in my report, I said there is sufficient evidence pointing to the need for additional investigation. Maybe it's a way of getting out of the dilemma you've just raised, Shreya, but it is a real one. As a special rapporteur, and I think as any human rights person, we don't necessarily want to end up judging before there has been a formal process and that person has had the opportunity to defend himself or herself. That being said, there have been many moments over my career where I've thought, gosh, I wish I could name that guy, or this, because they are so horrible and the power they have over life and death. And, so I welcome the fact that some NGOs now are moving into naming individuals. I think there is, we need to take full stock of the environment within which we do. It's not a role for special rapporteur. They need to be careful, and I think that the way I proceeded was the way of being careful. But there may be a role for, we don't need to all be singing to the same tune. If some NGOs some journalist, whoever wants to point the finger and said that particular person has ordered that crime and he did that in such and such fashion, you know. We're talking human rights violation here. It's going to happen. It's happening now, and let's see how we can control it, how we can make sure it doesn't get out of hands. Let's make sure that we keep the principle of justice very high in our agenda. But so many people get away with murder right now. So many people get away with it.
Oh, well, thanks, Agnès, for that really interesting set of answers and reflecting on the idea that, you know, legal tools of accountability are not the only ones, and sometimes the ones that civil society and exercise are important. And of course, it also brings us quite close to that, you know, the novel principles underlying the Magnitsky Acts, which we're seeing spreading out around the world. And we know how unpopular those are with the people whom they target. It's a very effective mechanism for accountability for gross human rights violations. So we're coming to the end of the time. I wanted to give Peter an opportunity if there was anything in all of that that he'd like to respond to before we come to the end. Peter.
Maybe just one thing. I think enforcement of some regulations, especially within the context of EU and maybe Hungary, but not just Hungary, other member states as well, is also a question of, you know, political willingness. I think, and again, this is one Hungarian example, but I think it, you know, it has relevance to other countries as well. When these mergers happened, when the Mega Foundation was created with the 450 outlets, the Prime Minister made this exempt from regulatory oversight. The competition authority was told not to look at this because obviously it posed some questions about, you know, monopolies and market power and that sort of stuff. And then we are part of the European Union, and I'm in some European institutions maybe, you know, more inclined or more reluctant at times to enforce existing regulations, and always very sort of, I don't like when around social media platforms or others when sort of politicians talk about legislating content. I'm a fervent believer in like free speech. I'm in favor of. Even some problematic speech I think should be free. Not all, but I have a pretty wide range. But we do have some laws around state subsidies and monopolies and things that authoritarian countries use to influence the media sphere in their own countries, and especially within the EU, and I'm talking about Hungary and Poland here mainly. I think these rules could be used if there was, you know, willingness on an EU level to use them.
Yes, and I think it really fits with, you know, Agnès' remarks that we need to be looking at a range of ways of mechanisms and tools to try to ensure to protect human rights that might not ordinarily be seen as the tools of human rights lawyers and activists. Well, that brings us to the end of what has been a really fascinating conversation. I'd really like to thank Agnès and Peter for their great presentations and for the work that they both do, which we know is enormously courageous in a world which is not always a safe place for human rights practitioners. So thank you both for being here today and for all that you do. I'd also like to thank everybody who's attended and for your interesting questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to quite all of them, but thank you very much for attending. And finally, to say that there are a couple more events coming up before the end of term that people might like to put into their diaries. Personally, we've got 2 roundtables which we're partnering with the International Commission of Jurists on civil liability for human rights violations. So fitting in a sense with Agnès and Peter's finishing remarks, looking at a non-traditional ways of enforcing or holding people to account for human rights violations. And there we're particularly looking at corporate liability. And we also have a series of book launches over the end of this term. So keep an eye on the Bonavera website for those. Some really interesting conversations will be happening in that regard. And then finally to say this is the last Bonavera discussion group of the year, and I'd like to thank the team at the Bonavera who are so extraordinary in putting this all together. So Gayatri Taraturital, who's here with us, Rosie Finn, who's also here with us, and a whole range of others who work hard every week to make sure that we can host the events we do online. It's not clear yet what Michaelmas term or October, November will bring in terms of whether events will be still online. What we have been able to do here is host such a wonderful array of visitors who might not have been able to come to Oxford, and also to be able to host an enormous number of listeners who might not be able to come to Oxford. So it's quite likely that at least some of these events will continue online, even if by Michaelmas the risks of the public health crisis are somewhat behind us. In the meantime, wishing you all well over the summer months, and look forward to seeing you back at a Bonavera discussion group next year. Final thanks again to Agnes and Peter for great presentations. Bye now.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.